Welcome back to our discussion, Real ID Application Processing, sponsored by Kodak Alaris here on Federal News Network. My guests today are Kyle Kottner, the Public Sector Business Development Manager at Kodak Alaris. Michael Leahy is the Secretary of Information Technology for the state of Maryland. Ian Grossman is the Vice President of Member Services and Public Affairs for the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators. And Charles Norman is the Registrar of Motor Vehicles for the state of Ohio. And Kyle, why don't we start with you on what a typical and well-working workflow looks like for processing all of the paperwork that has to be verified, stored, returned, I guess, in good condition to the originator, and resulting in what we now call a real ID, driver's license, or other form of ID.
So thank you so much, Tom. So in the digital age, obviously, that we're currently in, people expect efficiencies that they have not expected so much in the past, I would say. And the documents that these folks at the DMV are using, or trying to process rather, scan in, are very sensitive documents. They are not just only utility bills, they are very sensitive documents such as Social Security cards, birth certificates. So we need to make sure that the folks at the DMV are utilizing hardware that does not destroy these very important documents. And so it's all about, obviously, efficiency. At the end of the day, it's all about efficiency. And what we're also seeing is we need smart scanning in. So it's not just, oh, let me walk this over, a few feet and scan these documents in. We need to find a way where each person at these centers, right next to their desk, can have a tool to use, a scanner to use, to scan in these documents, just to make the process much quicker. Because, like I said earlier, at the end of the day, it's all about efficiency.
Okay, well, Charlie, let's go to Ohio for a minute. And what is the workflow and the technology base? What happens when someone comes in, they've got a pile of paper, and I want a real ID card?
Well, the first thing we hope happens is they go to our website first. When they go to the BMV's website, we have an interactive document checklist to sort of help people decide, okay, what exactly do I need to bring with me? And we find that's and that education process is really our biggest challenge. People just aren't used to the additional documentation they're required to bring in for a real ID transaction. But once that happens, and we find generally that people that do go to our website are much prepared and have a smoother process, but they come into one of our deputy registrar offices around the state, and they present their documents at the point of service, at which point the clerk working the transaction scans those documents, and they're indexed and associated with that customer's record. So it's, as I mentioned, it's a manual process. The clerks are having to verify those documents, verify that they are indeed authentic. And they're also at some point pinging any number of outside agencies to confirm, for instance, Social Security number comes back and it is associated with that individual. So it's time consuming. We found that in Ohio, a real ID transaction takes 3 to 4 times as long as a standard driver's license transaction. So, in a state where we have 8 million drivers, you can imagine the backlog that has the potential to create.
Sure. I guess making an analogy to TSA, where they measure if a half-second change in process could make their lines go all the way around the block, 2 or 3 minutes on a DMV type of transaction could be hours and hours for people that come in thinking they'll get in and out of there.
Right. And so, we're constantly trying to balance that desire to achieve efficiency with really the need to achieve for security as well, and making sure those documents are authentic and are real and the person is who they say they are. So that's sort of our challenge every day, and we're getting better. But I imagine it's something that every motor vehicle agency in the country is having to deal with.
And not to get overly detailed, but we will, because that's what we can do here. How do you handle documents of different sizes? Like the Social Security card has come up. That's about the size of, I guess, a Medicare card. Totally different from a birth certificate, which shapes are all over the place depending on where they started, and so on. How do you
Yes, I mean, I can tell you, it is difficult. So in Ohio, we have it's a single scan per document, so which makes it that much more time consuming. So you're not really feeding these things in through a page scanner. We're scanning one document at a time.
Got it. And can you do it with one machine, or do you have to have a whole bunch of machines?
It is one machine, yeah, thankfully.
All right, Kyle, you want to add to that?
Charles, it breaks my heart to hear that it's just one document at a time, to be honest with you. No, Tom, to go into greater detail, obviously, like Charles said, obviously some people do one document at a time, but there is technology out there that can have extended flatbeds and such that can process these documents much quicker, and also utilize technology to basically make sure that a page may be perfect in a way. So basically see, hey, this information is correct on this document. It's not missing an address. It's not missing a number on a social security card or a birth certificate. So there is technology out there to utilize. It's obviously up to the states to decide what they want to use.
Okay, and on that note, we'll go to Mike Leahy. What's the process in Maryland, and what's some of the technology base that supports the process?
Absolutely. Well, as you said at the beginning, Maryland has been doing this a bit longer than some other folks, and we've learned a number of lessons along the way. I think before I talk about the technology, the most interesting piece of this, which you touched on, is that we have people with very different experiences based on their age. For example, when I started driving, there were no cell phones. There was no internet. Whereas my grandchildren, who are reaching the age that they're starting to drive, expect to do everything on this. And so there is a very different set of expectations. And what we have found is that folks who are older are obviously more comfortable with paper and very much more likely to accept the process. Whereas youngsters are saying, why can't I just take a picture of this on my phone and send it to you? So to Kyle's point, our scanning methodology does several things that I think go farther than most. And that is, as he said, we scan to recognize certain documents and look for information on that document in a specific location. So we are effectively determining whether the document itself fulfills the request for what it's there for and can be authenticated. And so that information can be collected and tested, for example, against social security numbers or against addresses or against utility accounts, things of that sort, that you can quasi-automate those processes to get feedback almost immediately. The second piece is what happens after that with the technology, because as Kyle and Charles both said, we are moving more and more into a world where we are going to create digital certificates and digital means of demonstrating the verification, because in the past, paper was the best thing we had. Well, we now have other tools, and so the real issue becomes, how do we create a trust factor associated with those tools that people will accept them the way we've historically accepted paper? And lots of technology challenges, and it's an extraordinarily interesting time. There's a lot of talk about technology called self-sovereign identification, which usually involves blockchain technology. And there's also a lot of push now for what we call zero sum or zero factor authentication, where we trust nothing, but because of the biometrics and other information that we can garner in real time about an individual's location or characteristics about them, we can demonstrate that the information is valid. And I suspect over time that will be incorporated into Real ID. But for the present, as Kyle and Charles have both said, the key is to make certain that we can speed up the process as much as possible for the ordinary citizen coming into the MVA to deal with this. We also have checklists online. We have clerks that one can call if they don't understand particular requests in terms of documentation and clarify that before they come in. We also have set up a methodology that people can make appointments online and are guaranteed to actually be able to see a clerk within 15 minutes of their appointment time. And so we effectively don't create queues because everybody decides to go to the MVA on Friday morning. We in effect limit the access so that people are not going to be standing in line for significant periods of time.
Interesting. I was going to say when I first started to drive, there was no fuel injection. In fact, they didn't even have cup holders. You had to hold that bottle of Bud between your knees. But nowadays, everything is much well equipped. But what you say implies that there is a degree of intelligence and back office automation that goes with the mechanical processes like scanning and taking in paperwork. And that's really the key to that efficiency.
Yeah, absolutely. As I think Kyle would tell you if asked, if we can define a workflow well, we can automate it. And the real issue is making certain that we simplify these processes as much as possible so that any complication in the workflow that requires additional manual handling is reduced, and ultimately the process can move much faster.
And Ian, is there any kind of clearinghouse across the nation for motor vehicle administrators such that these best practices can be shared and the learning is transferred from one to the other and maybe get some of the less sophisticated operations up to speed?
Absolutely. That's at the core what AAMVA is all about in terms of sharing that knowledge of how different states are implementing the lessons they're learning, what's working, what's a challenge. Our community connects with each other every day in different formats, some in large gatherings, some just a couple of states and different agencies connecting. And we are happy to facilitate that sharing of information, the documenting of best practices, helping to liaison with the Department of Homeland Security to do all that. And in those conversations, one of the things that's happened that I think is relevant to this idea of paper and business flow is what Charlie referred to earlier as Real ID modernization. So in late December, when Congress passed the omnibus bill, they included in it Real ID language that we refer to as Real ID modernization, which now opens the door for states to do things that are more modern, more technology common today than when the act and the rules were written in the mid 2000s. Specifically, the idea that someone can take a picture or scan their own documents, upload it in advance so that it's there waiting for the DMV clerk as opposed to the clerk having to start from scratch. There's also the availability, Mike talked a lot about the idea of verifying the data versus the piece of paper. The act allows for, if states don't want to collect a piece of paper for the Social Security number, they no longer need to do that. They just need to collect the number itself and then verify that data electronically. So we're seeing this through this Real ID modernization, this first step of saying, okay, we recognize that Real ID was written in 2005. We live in a different world. How do we leverage the modern tools but still keep the integrity of a secure credential and making sure these individuals are who they say they are?
Interesting. And on that regard, Kyle, I have a question for you, and that is, we've been talking about scanning and so on, but there's also an element of imaging in here. And sometimes documents are old or they're imperfect. I think you alluded to that. So is it possible to build into the system some sort of a corrective or verification that this document, old or crumbling as it might be, or smudged, whatever the case might be, is nevertheless acceptable and then can be loaded into the workflow and proceed from there?
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. So while there is hardware that processes these documents, there is software that will basically look through these documents and make sure that the information is accurate, and also uh, make the information look better on the computer or on the screen. Yeah, there definitely is technology out there to make the page look a bit more perfect, I would say, for the document to be processed.
Okay, well, good. Then we'll make sure that gets built in across the country. On that note, we'll take a short break. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. This discussion is Real ID Application Processing, sponsored by Kodak Alaris here at Federal News Network.